Today, we're going to start talking about the Cold War, um, and we're going to actually divide it into two different pieces. The first part will be uh, about basically going up to the end of the Korean War, and then the next part will be about mostly the Vietnam War. Okay, so that's where we're going to go, and then after that, we'll talk about civil rights. The first thing we want to think about, a couple things really. The first one is that we think of the Cold War as something that was a very dangerous and kind of anxious period of time, but it wasn't really a serious conflict. But that is wrong. There was a lot of shooting and killing going on in the Cold War. It's just the reason why they call it a Cold War is because the United States and the Soviet Union never actually um, got to the point of conflict, although they were close a couple times. Um, but instead, what happened was that the Soviets and the United States fought wars through proxies. So there were wars in Central Asia, and there were wars in Southeast Asia, and there were wars in Spanish America, where the United States and the Soviets fought through proxies, and there were a lot of people that were killed in those conflicts. But uh, the reason why we call it cold again is because the United States and the Soviets didn't actually uh, uh, engage in direct conflict with each other. Okay, and the reason for that was because it was too dangerous. It had become too dangerous, and we'll hopefully see kind of how that works here in the next couple of lectures. Okay, so well, where does the Cold War start? And the next thing is that we generally think of the Cold War as really coming right out of World War II, meaning that the Cold War, we can pinpoint the time when the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies stopped cooperating against the Germans and the Japanese, and set out on their own kind of course, with their own strategy. And that was right after the surrender of Germany. In there was a conference at a place called Potsdam. Potsdam, it was um, the palace of the Kaiser in Berlin, and there was a conference between the United States and the Soviet Union and France and Britain over the post-war security arrangement. And it was at this conference that the Soviets stopped cooperating with the West. Okay, the reason why we won't, I mean, that's when we say that the Cold War actually started, but in reality, the Cold War started much earlier. And it really started during the Russian Revolution, which we talked about briefly when we talked about World War One. And one of the outcomes of the Russian Revolution was the establishment of the Soviet state. And the Soviet state was driven by the idea of a communist revolution. If you guys, we've talked briefly about the strategy of communism, the Marxist strategy, which was that there would be a spontaneous um, revolution of the working classes who would rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie, and then they would establish a essentially a workers' paradise. That never happened, and over time, uh, Marxist thinkers tried to theorize why, even though Marx's prediction didn't come true, how he was still right. And one of the ways that they did that was by saying that the the revolution wasn't going to be spontaneous, that it had to be led. And so there was a vanguard of the revolution, intellectual vanguard, and this idea was taken up by Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin was the one of the I guess you could say founders of the Soviet state, and his idea was that the revolution had to be led. Okay, and so but the Marxist theory was that once the revolution had started, then it would spread everywhere. So Marx had said that the revolution, when he wrote in 1848, from his point of view, the revolution is now, and it's going to end up everywhere. But in reality, the Marxist revolution happened never and nowhere. All right. But when the Russians had their revolution and they established the Soviet state, their idea was that they were the beginning of this worldwide communist revolution. And that from that point of view, they adopted a stated foreign policy of opposing capitalism, of spreading communism. The idea was that they were going to spread communism everywhere, that this communist revolution would happen everywhere, but it had to be led, and it would be led by the Soviets. So this was goes back to 1924. 1924 was when the Soviet state was established, and they stated that their intention was to overthrow capitalism. Um, and of course, with capitalism goes the idea of liberalism, the idea of democracy, and those things that we tend to believe in here in the West, right? Okay, so that's where the Cold War started. There was really no um, there was no way to compromise between capitalism and communism, because communism, the theory behind communism was that it couldn't be successful anywhere unless it was successful everywhere. All right. So even though they established a communist state in the Soviet Union, from their point of view, the revolution had to continue until communism was established everywhere. And that meant the overthrow of the United States and Britain and all the Western democracies. You guys are following me here? And so this is one of the reasons why after World War One, there was a big, what they call Red Scare, where people were afraid of the Soviets. They were afraid that the communists were coming, the Reds are coming, and they're going to take over the country. And that kind of subsided, but it didn't really end. And when the United States allied with the Soviet Union, that alliance was an alliance of convenience. The alliance was that both sides had a greater enemy. And so I think that the best way that you could describe the alliance was the way that Winston Churchill described it when he said that if Hitler invaded hell, he would be allied with Satan. Okay, it was an alliance that was meant to oppose Germany, but once the Germans had been defeated, there was nothing to hold the alliance together. Okay, and so then what happens is that they come together at this conference at Potsdam in Germany, and the idea then is that they're going to establish a security system for Europe after World War II, but the Soviets withdraw. They refuse to compromise. And the reason why is because from their point of view, they can't compromise with the West because it's capitalist. And so instead, they establish their own zone of control in Eastern Europe. And when we look at this map here, you can see that basically the line between what's purple and what's not purple is what we will eventually end up calling the Iron Curtain. Okay, and the idea is that Germany, basically where this line is where the Soviet troops had stopped at the end of the war. So they continued to control all the territory that they had occupied during the war, and they established um, puppet states, basically that were that had allegiance to were dominated by the Soviet Union, including Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and all these other states here. Okay, all right. So that's when we see the rhetorical beginning of the Cold War is right after the war. Winston Churchill, who's no longer Prime Minister of England, comes to America to deliver a speech in Missouri with President Truman sitting on the stage with him, and he declares that an iron curtain has fallen across the continent of Europe, and that's that basically that line that I showed you. Okay, and this is where we see the United States start to develop its opposition to Soviet expansion. So now the Americans were kind of taken aback. The Americans, I'd have to say, were a little naive, and not just the Americans. I mean, Winston Churchill at one point thought that he could recruit Joseph Stalin to be part of the Democratic Club, but the Americans thought that since the United States and the Soviets had been allies in World War II, that they would continue to have friendly relations after World War II. And so they were kind of taken aback about why they saw this opposition coming from the Soviet Union. And so there was a diplomat who had been stationed in Moscow for a long period of time. He wasn't the ambassador. He was a career diplomat. And they asked him, he was an expert on Soviet policy, and they asked him to explain why the Soviets were behaving the way that they were. And he responded with an 8,000 word telegram, which ended up being called the Long Telegram. Does anybody want to guess why it was called the Long Telegram?
It was 8,000 words.
Yeah, because it was long. Okay, so so at any rate, in this telegram, he describes Soviet strategy in Europe. Okay, so let's just take a look at the strategy here, that the Soviet policy is motivated by European political history. Okay, so the Soviets, basically their interest is they want to protect themselves from Germany because they've been invaded by Germany twice in the same century. And they also want to be able to control, this area here, because it's really the only warm water port that the Soviets have is here in the Crimean Peninsula, right? So they're interested in controlling this area because they were strangled. This is what had caused them to be knocked out of the war in World War One. So they wanted to control this area, and they wanted to establish a buffer between, particularly Germany and the Soviet Union. All right, so that's the kind of European historical part of their strategy. The other part of the strategy was that, again, they wanted to expand communism everywhere, right? So they wanted to expand communism into Western Europe, and they would do it either by elections or by force, essentially, right? Okay, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But the point here is that the Soviets then are not interested in peaceful coexistence, again, because communism can't work anywhere unless it works everywhere. And they are determined to advance socialism. They, what Kennan argued was that the way to counter Soviet strategy was what was called containment. And basically the idea of containment thinks of communism as a kind of a cancer, right? And it's a cancer that's inoperable. You can't cut it out because the Soviet Union was too powerful to confront militarily, but you could keep it from spreading. And so his idea then was not to confront communism, but to keep it from spreading. And that's going to be the strategy that the West will adopt. And we'll talk about that in just a couple minutes, right? The other kind of thing here is that the Soviet power was impervious to the logic of reason. It's highly sensitive to the logic of force. And one of the things that Kennan noted was that if the Kremlin, if the Soviets were met with strong resistance, then they would back down. So what he suggested was a policy that comes to be known as brinksmanship, meaning that if the Soviets, how should I say this? If the Soviets make an advance, an aggressive advance, and their advance is met by the same amount of aggression, then that eventually they will back down. So the idea of brinksmanship then is that both sides continue to advance aggression until it reaches the brink of war, and then once you reach the brink of war, the Soviets will back down. Okay, so that's going to be part of the Western strategy. All right, you guys are with me? Questions, comments about this? Now, here's the thing. The thing about the Kennan telegram was that it was intended to describe Soviet policy in Europe. The way that the United States interpreted it was that this policy should be enforced everywhere. And so after World War II, we're going to see a movement towards socialism in many places in the world, which again, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Much of it is not driven by the Soviets. Much of it is, although it is supported by the Soviets, much of it is actually driven by the fact that many of these countries that were formerly colonized now find themselves independent but poor, and so socialism to them looks like a good strategy, right? And so what will happen is you'll see the Soviets on the one hand publicly stating that their strategy is to overthrow capitalism, and overthrow communism everywhere, to establish communism everywhere. And at the same time, we see countries like Southeast Asia and different countries in Africa and different countries in South America who are kind of playing, dabbling, I guess you could say, with socialism. And the Americans are going to attribute it all to Moscow, right? So this phrase that I've put here, monolithic world communist movement based in Moscow, what this says is that wherever you see communism in the world, the Soviets are behind it. It's not true, but this is the way the Americans are going to approach the subject. And this is going to really lay the foundation for a lot of tragedy that's going to follow, okay? Because as I mentioned, there are places in the world where people are making a choice for socialism, but the Americans will not see that as a free choice. They'll see that as something that's being driven from Moscow, and so they will be opposed to it. And again, we'll see how that works here in the next couple of lectures.